Is Westminster quite literally broken? This week, I'm joined by Nicholas Boyd-Smith to discuss the process of restoring the Palace of Westminster and if it tells us anything about the state of broken Britain. Hello and welcome to the Critic Show, and I'm joined for the first time today by a guest, Nicholas Boyd-Smith of Create Streets. Nicholas, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a very difficult journey down the road from the Create Streets office, about 7 doors to your podcast office.
Oh, but it is very cold.
That's why I had a scarf. But but no, it's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
No, it's okay. Thank you for coming on. The reason I've asked you on is that you've done a couple of fantastic pieces.
Thank you very much. Stop there. Fantastic. No more discussion required.
You've done a couple of fantastic pieces for us on the Palace of Westminster, and there was some news, I think, earlier last week. Basically, that the decision on whether to restore the palace has been delayed until I think 2030.
I've given up following. How frequently it's been delayed and until what date, because the one thing we definitely know is it'll get delayed again and we're just going to push it out. So, yes, I mean, it's just an endless seething uselessness.
Yeah. So this has already been going on for a decade, hasn't it? And it's still not agreed, insofar as I understand it, still not agreed with the Treasury how much it's going to cost, how much they're allowed to spend on it. They won't now have to, the delay of the decision means they won't have to choose a plan for restoration until 2030. And this raises big prospects, I think, for a Notre Dame-style burning down of the building, which actually is very similar to how the building came to be there in the first place, isn't it?
Yes, that's a brutal irony. Yes, I mean, I can respond either on how we started or where we are now.
I think let's begin at the beginning, as Dylan Thomas would say.
Right, so 16th of October, 1834, one of the few dates I remember in history because it's the same date as my birthday. So that and sort of cutting off the head of Marie Antoinette sticks the 16th of October in my head. So yes, disastrous fire. I mean, it started with sort of, it's important not to sort of mythologize the past. It started with a series of acts of quite grotesque stupidity. As a malign stupidity. So the caretakers decided to clear out the clutter of all these old tally sticks, which are actually priceless historic documents, essentially the economic records and accounts of medieval England, which I think on balance, I mean, I'm not actually asked any historians about this, but I think we can confidently assume modern medieval historians would wish still existed.
Yeah.
So point one, bad thing to get rid of. Point two, what you don't do is throw them en masse with high flammability into an open fire at night, which is what they proceeded to do. And surprisingly, started a major conflagration. So it was a stupidity beyond words.
It's nice to know Britain's always been so badly going.
Well, I mean, I think, other countries had fires too. So this causes actually a very famous fire. And as you probably know, you've probably seen the painting. So both Turner and Constable, both born within a year of each other, 50 years earlier, they both, as did so many Londoners, sort of watched the fire, as also did a young, slightly strange Catholic convert called Augustus Pugin and a rather more established architect called Charles Barry. And most prescient of all, the caretaker to the Royal Academy of Arts said to some of the young architects as they went down to watch it, "Oh, good news, lots of work there, lads." And he was right on that. So it's an act of immense stupidity. But then, I mean, it was criticised at the time, but actually the process of rebuilding it was, it was jolly impressive. Within 4 months, by February, they'd rebuilt, because actually it didn't all burn down, I should say. Obviously, that Westminster Hall, as you know, was there. But actually, bits of the St. Stephen's Cloister, quite a few walls were still standing, but just sort of ceilingless. So they patched it up pretty quickly. By February, both the House of Commons and the House of Lords were rehoused in temporary structures that, probably we sort of would half wish still existed, if we're being honest. So, point one. Point two, by December of the next year, they ran the competition. They decided to do it anonymously. There had been George Smirk, who's the guy who architect behind the British Museum, was going to do the whole thing, but then there was a sort of push against that. Said no, we want to get the best we can. It was a time of great sort of conflict is perhaps not quite the right word, but tension between Goths and classicists. And there were different views, and it was exactly the same time that Pugin, this very strange young man, was writing this book that became a sort of, not quite a bestseller, but it certainly had enormous influence, called Contrasts, where he was basically saying to build in a Gothic style is Christian and more kindly to the poor. So there's lots of discussion about this. So they had a competition with a bunch of MPs and courtiers as the jury, anonymous, and they stipulated that it must be Gothic or Elizabethan. That was in the brief,
right?
Which I think is quite interesting. As there are debates in America about how the government should build buildings. Yeah. So that was in the brief. Sorry, I'm probably giving you too much detail, but by January, so within 2 months, they basically got the 97 or 95, 97 things in, and they made their decision, which was Charles Barry. He, right from the start, was using this young guy Pugin to draw some of his detail. He was already working with him in the King Edward VI Grammar School in Birmingham, and then starts this process, which did go over budget. So the initial budget was about 700k. This is all in, obviously, in 1830s money, which is a lot of money now, even more then. By the end, they ended up spending about 2.5 million. It's quite hard to entirely work it out. And obviously, the value of money changed a bit over that time. They're less than it would now. Most of it, so the House of Lords were in by, they embanked the Thames. So they grew London out into the Thames. By 1847, they had the House of Lords up to enormous praise. By 1850, they had the House of Commons up. That didn't go so well. The MPs complained that it was echoey and too small.
Yeah,
it stayed too small, but they reduced the ceiling and then reopened it in 1852. And by 1860, what we now call Elizabeth Tower, then the Clock Tower, the Victoria Tower, the tower in the middle was basically all done. Barry died in 1860. Pugin already died, and there was another sort of a bit less than 10 years of sort of fiddling around and finishing things. But over the course of a generation, essentially a new neighbourhood was created, which was sort of the most instantly famous insto-pastiche piece of architecture, arguably anywhere in the world, and one this incredibly tiny set of buildings that nearly everyone in the world, who hasn't just lived in a dark village somewhere, will recognise. And immediately can locate it, and which has immediately got that symbolic power. I don't think the Statue of Liberty in America is probably the only physical structure that is as immediately recognized. I'm not even sure that's a structure. Eiffel Tower in France. It's a very, very upper echelon, and that's what they designed. So yes, from a fire like the Phoenix, a great bird arose.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic.
Sorry, far too much detail.
No, not at all. I found that absolutely fascinating.
It's very polite, very polite. We'd like to all your guests. Yes, thank you.
One of the interesting things I think you do in your article is I was watching a Jonathan Meade's program for about the fourth or fifth time the other day. I was watching Ben Building, it's his history of Italian architecture under Mussolini.
Okay. I must confess I have not watched that.
Absolutely fascinating. And one of the points he makes, and I've read it in a couple of other books as well, the Edifice Complex, I think, was the other book I read in it, which there's that you shouldn't try and impart some kind of notional deeper meaning on a building just because it's been commissioned by a regime. I was reading the Edifice Complex, and it said basically, there is no kind of Stalinist, fascist, Nazi architecture as there is a Gothic architecture. It's just a taste for the monumental. And I think one of the really interesting things you do in your piece is that you make it much more about the process of reconstructing the building, which I think is fascinating. And you call it, I'm going to quote this because I thought it was absolutely fantastic.
What did I say?
The quintessential exemplar of broken Britain. So can you just expand on that? Because, you just talked about, it was fiddling about for 10 years, but within a generation, that whole neighbourhood was created. We've been deciding what to do for 10 years. So can you kind of slow walk us through the process of how we've...
I'll just say one thing, if I mention one more thing actually in response to that quote, and then I will answer your question. So, I think it's just very interesting, that point you make. And weirdly, it links to Pugin, who I was talking about, who was a sort of mad genius, basically, and workaholic. 2 wives sort of died because he couldn't keep up with him, and third outlived him. He did imbue physical structures and style with morality, and sincerely, I mean insanely, regarded classical as sort of essentially sort of pagan and wrong, and Christian as the only true path to goodness and to virtue. And interesting, there's a very famous book from 1977 by architecture historian David Watkin on this called Morality in Architecture. He argued, and I think it's relevant in this topic, in this subject, that essentially, and a bit perversely, Pugin was the antecedent of the modernists in ascribing good moral virtues to one style and bad to another. So ever since, most architectural historians, certainly most architects, essentially have regarded modernism as sort of good, contemporary and honest, and anything that imbues ornament or texture or detail is somehow dishonest. And but slightly ironically, it's exactly the same flaw, I would argue, that Pugin, for all his brilliance, made conceptually. So that's not your question, but it's too obvious a response to not make, so forgive me. Right, so come back to your question.
Love to be corrected.
No, I'm not correcting you. I'm not correcting you. No, I'm commenting on it. I'm not. No, your point was very fair. No, I guess I'm making the link to our subject.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
So to come back to your question, so I should preface what I'm saying, which is there are so many. I mean, it must be hundreds of thousands of pages of bump on the restoration program that no one human being has read them all, and I certainly haven't. So, if there's anyone watching who is deep in it, they will obviously know more than me. It's more. I mean, this in a way is the point. It's more than any human brain can get their head around, and I think they've made a very, very fundamental conceptual flaw, and then we get to a process flaw.
Okay,
their conceptual flaw is they've aligned, amalgamated things that do need to be done. Things that it would be sort of sensible to do, but are not essential, and things that are pretty much in the nice to have category. Yeah. So it's any building that's best part of 200 years old is going to need rework. It's going to have evolving technologies. There's asbestos in there. There's 200 years of wiring, lots of which is now OTOs and presents a fire risk. We do now manage buildings, certainly thinking about compartmentalization and fire risk differently, normally more effectively. There's a whole bunch of things that should be done.
And of course, famously, there's no single wiring diagram, right? So nobody knows where all the wires go.
But I find that's quite normal, actually. That it's quite hard to hold on to that sort of organic information. However, to try and turn a building built in the first half of the 19th century into a building that operates as if it was a modern building in terms of its airtightness is a fool's errand. And I think it's conceptually flawed. Environmental campaigners tend to think of energy in use, or how much energy it takes to heat or cool a building. And that I'm not denying its importance, but actually, most of the energy in a building is just the energy of building the damn thing. So the moment you've got a building that's 2 or 3 or 4 or 500 years old, it's sort of by definition a very energy efficient building, because it's just hanging around being used for a long time. If you have to knock something down every 50 years, that's a very inefficient, unsustainable, to use the modern jargon, way of building a building. And here's the great irony. Most modern buildings which claim to be more thermally efficient don't last as long and are thus less energy efficient overall.
Yeah. And that's a coming trend in architecture, isn't it? Because I'm thinking Barnabas Calder wrote a book recently that was basically, I think it was from prehistory to the climate crisis, and it's an architectural history but told through essentially energy usage.
Yeah, and so to think about the sustainability of a building, you should think about its durability as well. It's interesting, the French don't use the word sustainability, they use the word durabilité, durability. So to talk about that same confluence of energy efficiency, almost verbally, they put the focus somewhere else, which I think is frankly wise. I mean, it's just by chance, really. So I think there's actually a flaw in how they're thinking about the program. And then thirdly, they're throwing in things which are nice to have. So creating a bigger visitor centre. Right, well, I think it's fine. I think it's reasonable to say that a parliament in the 21st century is going to think more about visitors than in the early 19th century. I think that's a reasonable thing. But it's quite hard to do. And if it means it's adding an extra billion or so to the cost of doing it, well, maybe we should just put it somewhere else.
Yeah.
So there's I think there's a conceptual flaw. And then, as your question, I think, sort of intimated, they have just not been able to manage the process properly. And my observation would be, I don't think I could sort of completely prove this, but just reading quite a lot of the bump a few months ago when I wrote the first article, it's consultants running the process. It's the tail wagging the dog. The amount of, interventions, studies, surveys that have been done is out of control. My observation, having sat on various committees that oversee, nothing quite like that, but complex programs.
Yeah.
So, there's always a consultant who will tell you that what you need is the survey he's selling. And this has got completely out of control. And what they need to do, and you mentioned France and Notre Dame, and I think Notre Dame was a good example, they need to manage to a timeline and to a deadline, not to a process. So, right, we're going to have this done by 1830, interesting slip, by 2030 or by 2035. I honestly don't know which. In a way, that depends on what they want to do. And we will just drive to that. And we'll set a budget, and that's what it's going to be. And just make that the God, as Macron did actually effectively. So that Notre Dame, he immediately saw, as was seen after the fire in the 1830s, that what had happened here had a sacerdotal as well as a practical consequence.
Yeah,
it was very, watching, as I did actually on television, the fire at Notre Dame.
Yeah,
I'm an Englishman, just in case your audience hadn't spotted that. I was very moved.
Yes.
And I'm implicated. My wife is French, so I have a link to France. My wife was in tears, and I feel myself slightly emotional thinking about it. I was very, very moved.
I was very emotional when I went to go and visit the Paris Olympics, actually, because it still wasn't built.
No, and so Macron got that. Now, we're not at the same situation. There hasn't been thank God, a new disastrous fire at the House of Parliament, but he immediately saw that this was something of, I'll deliberately use the word, of sacerdotal consequence for France. That would be the case were the House of Commons to burn down. Mm-hmm. I think even despite our deep cynicism about modern political system, I think that would have great significance to the British people. Perhaps not to everyone, but I think to a majority. So the fact the fire hasn't happened doesn't mean we shouldn't treat it with the same gravitas, because Notre Dame, though not perhaps quite as visually recognisable to the wider world, does have immense significance to the French.
Yes.
And has been that crucible of moments of the history. So it's where Charles de Gaulle went to sing his Te Deums after the liberation of Paris, and there were still gunshots ran out from the belfry, and de Gaulle, he stayed absolutely ramrod straight and saw the service through. So I think we've got to bring that level of, let's dive to the line, pass primary legislation, put a general or a retired chief executive in charge. Probably someone, he or she would obviously need deep heritage and conservation experts at the most senior level advising him or her, but probably someone who's not an expert, actually, because the danger of just having experts in charge is they want to perfect everything. And I think that's clearly what's happened here.
So you need a project manager, not a architectural
project manager with sort of double stars and epaulets. But someone who'll say, do you know what? It would be lovely to understand what the air conditioning survey of that is or the consequence of that, but it's just not at the first order. We just got to manage this differently. And yes, I'm afraid my observation, having worked with the British state a bit in various guises, is it's essentially become just bunged up with over complexity, over process, what I call the CCL culture, inability to make decisions, lack of incentives to take risks or to actually achieve something on deadline. It's always easier just to pass the buck down the line. And it's not. I sincerely mean, this is going to sound like I'm special pity. It's not. Civil servants are not bad people. They're not out there trying to sort of screw the state or waste money, and nor are politicians, actually, at least not the vast majority of them. So people mean well, but we've got ourselves into a situation where culturally we're too risk averse, find it too problematic to make decisions, and then therefore don't manage to a deadline or to a budget. And sadly, the management of this great building, for which we should all be eternally grateful, I'm afraid is a case in point.
So to pull in kind of another thread to that, I had a friend who was an architect very, very early on in his career, and he was working on the project. And he was brutally honest with me, more so than probably should have been if he was sensible. Just said, we can essentially stick anything we want on.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Because the people who are managing this process have absolutely no knowledge of the building, and they have no knowledge of construction as well. And so talking about the kind of risk averseness of the people managing this process, do you think that some of that is to compensate really for a lack of technical knowledge? I mean, the technical knowledge that you need to reconstruct this building is very few and far between. But, there's... Actually, how many civic engineers are there in Parliament, I suppose, my fundamental question.
I don't know the answer to that, though. But I hope that was a bit...
I can guess.
Yeah. So, oddly, So I didn't, let it be told, I didn't know you were about to say that, because we've not spoken about this before. That rings very true, what your friend said. But I think I'd categorize the problem less one of lack of expertise, because actually I'm absolutely certain there will be more awareness of the management of old buildings and of the technical consequences of various scenarios currently deployed on the management of restorations building than ever before. Certainly the people at the top won't be experts in the same way. Actually, I'd argue shouldn't be. What they don't have, but anyway, haven't demonstrated, is the culture of we need to do this by a certain time on a certain budget, and our job is to deliver and to make stuff happen. So I think a little bit of lack of expertise, because it almost allows you to say, it doesn't matter, we're not going to do that bit. We don't need to do that ground survey. We know it's made out of Portland stone. The Portland stone is behaving better than the Anson stone. Basically, they used the wrong stone for the House of Commons. Right. A lot of which I understand, was actually then replaced in the 1930s. For some reason, they chose this slightly obscure, and I appreciate you're from Yorkshire, slightly obscure Yorkshire stone, which I don't think anyone else, I'm not aware has been used anywhere else in London. Doubtless has been used somewhere, called Anston stone, which basically started to corrode pretty quickly. Literally by the time they were finishing it, it was already palpably degrading. So for the last bit, after Charles Barry died in 1860, his son Edward Barry took over, and he very sensibly started using Portland stone, which is much more used in London, and basically it's a lot harder wearing. It's just harder wearing, exactly. So, but as I understand it, they then repaired a lot of the stone in the 1930s, and they also repaired the roof of Westminster Hall, which had started to degrade for reasons I couldn't explain. So keep doing that. It's not that hard, but I think we're trying to make the the good into the best, and we just have to cut some stuff from the programme. Except we're probably not going to have a state-of-the-art visitor centre in the House of Commons, and that's not ideal, but it's fine. There are other places in Westminster we could, or wider Westminster we could put them. I slightly cheekily, because I think it's an absurd building, suggested in my article, knocking down the foul Queen Elizabeth II Centre. I don't think that's a ridiculous suggestion. And replacing it with a Gothic tower, in which we can put a visitor centre and commercial offices and homes and heaven as well. Every single, this is one of my favourite little facts.
And that was the end of the free version of The Critics Show. If you'd like to hear the full, uncensored version, hop on over to outpoststudios.net and subscribe, where you'll also be able to listen to or watch the full suite of Outpost podcasts and documentaries. Thanks very much.